Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, we've had to wait until this minister's third year for him to make a statement, and all I think this statement confirmed was, firstly, how utterly bare this government's cupboard is on energy policy, and secondly, everyone's suspicion, already pretty well founded, that this minister, without a doubt, is the worst energy minister in living memory. Absolutely. Now, I've been in this portfolio for several years. I've worked with his predecessors, Ian Macfarlane, now at the QRC, and the now Treasurer. And these were people with whom I regularly disagreed on policy, but people, Ian and the Treasurer, who were well-renowned for being able to work across the aisle in the national interest. Well-renowned to be able to work across the aisle in the national interest. I did that with both of them in a constructive way, but this minister, according to all reports, finds it difficult even to work with his own colleagues, let alone work across the aisle. Now, at the end of the day, it reflects pretty poorly on this Prime Minister that he's decided, after the election, particularly after the hullabaloo of the coup against Malcolm Turnbull was all over, that he decided to keep this minister in this portfolio, an incompetent ideologue weighed down by a seemingly endless litany of scandals in this portfolio at a time of the biggest transformation in the global energy sector in living memory. This is this minister's third year in his job, and he's delivered two things, just two things. Now, he told us today he's delivered the Grid Reliability Fund. We haven't even begun debate on that legislation in this House. He told us he's delivered the refunding of ARENA, and we thank him for that, but this was a body that this government spent years and years trying to abolish. And he tells us that he's delivering the Integrated Systems Plan, a plan he described a couple of weeks ago as transmission lines to nowhere. In truth, the only two things this minister has delivered is a grant of almost $9 million to the operator of the Vales Point coal-fired power station and a grant of almost $4 million to Shine Energy, a company that's never delivered any project whatsoever, a grant which has been referred to and is being investigated by the Auditor-General, a grant that was announced before the department had even bothered to ask this company to apply for a grant to be able to conduct its own feasibility study into its own project. But to be fair to this minister, he never claimed to have any ambition to achieve anything positive in this sector. This minister was elected on a platform of stopping stuff, and he spent all his time as a backbencher advocating the stopping of stuff. This minister only believes in one thing in the energy portfolio, and that is to stop the expansion of renewable energy. This minister, before he was elected and as a backbencher, was, as we all know, the poster child of Alan Jones's anti-wind farm rallies. And then later on, along with Tony Abbott, along with the member for Hughes, along with the member for New England and a whole bunch of other fellow Trevors of that clique within the coalition party room, they ambushed the then Prime Minister and the then Treasurer, now Prime Minister, and the then Energy Minister, now Treasurer, and killed off the National Energy Guarantee, a policy that had been sought by this government, recommended to this government, supported by every single state government in the country, Labor and Liberal alike, supported by every business group, described by the now Prime Minister as the policy which had the greatest level of consensus he had ever seen in his time in the parliament, a policy which the now Prime Minister and the now Treasurer said would save households $550, but because it countenanced the expansion of some renewable energy, was ambushed and killed off by this minister when he was a junior. Well, they got their wish. They got their wish. The neg was gone. The last chance of an enduring bipartisan energy policy coming out of this parliament for the benefit of the nation, they got their wish. But like the dog that caught the car, like the dog that finally caught that car, this minister has had no idea what to do next. His first obligation, of course, was to report back to his mentor, Alan Jones, and he did that within a couple of days of being appointed Minister for Energy, and he reiterated to Alan his absolute commitment to stopping more solar and wind. He said to Alan, there's too much solar and wind in this system, and under him there would be no more. Of course, investor confidence collapsed, but that didn't bother the minister because he said, to use his words, a government should not even try to boost investor confidence. God forbid that would be the role of a government in a mixed private-public economy. His plan instead was to set up a policy, which he gives the fancy name of the Underwriting New Generation Investment, a policy he didn't refer to much to in his statement, a policy to be able to pick his own pet projects. No guidelines, no transparency, and has been pointed out by a number of these operators, no actual delivery except for a grant, as I said, to the Vales Point coal-fired power station. There was, in spite of the minister's best efforts to abolish the renewable energy target along with those fellow travellers several years ago, a final burst of investment in renewable energy over the last several years as the renewable energy target legislation tapered off. But there is a clear policy vacuum for investors, a policy vacuum business groups and obviously the industry complain about regularly. Even worse than a vacuum, they've got a situation where there's no investment framework coming out of this parliament and a policy that says at any moment this minister will issue a media release saying he intends to put taxpayer funds behind one of his pet projects that might end up competing with a private investment. And in contrast to what the minister said, after the renewable energy target tapered off last year, the Reserve Bank made it clear that investment collapsed by 50%. Now, this minister talks about installations. Of course, installations were still going strongly last year. They are a lagging indicator of financial decisions made 2 years earlier. The Reserve Bank, the industry itself, said investment decisions have collapsed because after the renewable energy target was completed, there was an utter policy vacuum. Now, this minister might try to pretend otherwise. The Reserve Bank of Australia made that point last year before COVID. And the University of Technology of Sydney has said because of that policy vacuum, 11,000 jobs in the renewable energy sector will be lost over the coming 2 years because of the lack of an investment framework, at a time when we need the creation of new jobs, in a sector that around the world is seeing investments created by the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Jobs are going backwards under this minister because of his ideology. Now, to cover up this abysmal lack of delivery, we saw a few weeks ago a week of announcements. This Prime Minister is good at announcements. He's very, very good at announcements. And one of them was the technology roadmap, a document that included some good things. Included, for example, a focus on hydrogen. We had a hydrogen policy last year at the election. The government then described hydrogen as snake oil. We're glad to see that they've changed their view about that. Hydrogen is something that I think this parliament as a whole can get behind. But there were some inexplicable details in this technology roadmap. Bioenergy. You'd think an area where members talk so much about regional Australia, you think an area they would support strongly. Bioenergy was utterly missing from this technology roadmap, but of course nuclear energy was in. Bioenergy out, nuclear energy in. Energy efficiency was described as an emerging technology. The International Energy Agency describes it as the first fuel. Around the world, we see energy efficiency as the best way of driving down power bills and energy bills more generally, the best way of creating new jobs. We see this in the UK, we see it in the United States, other parts of Europe and increasingly in developing countries like China. But for this minister, energy efficiency in one of the most energy inefficient economies in the world is just an emerging technology. And of course, after their ridiculous, hysterical campaign last year, electric vehicles simply warrants a watching brief. We'll just watch what's happening all around the world. No timetables, no milestones in this, some really weird, inexplicable detail, and all announcement, no delivery. And even, Deputy Speaker, for the centrepiece of this government's economic recovery strategy, hyped up over several months, puffed up over several months, the so-called gas-fired recovery, when it finally came out, full of spin, light as a feather on substance. First of all, this gas-fired recovery document that was released by the government does absolutely nothing to resolve the crisis that has emerged under this government and been in place for years. He talks about spot prices during the COVID pandemic, contract prices. The prices paid by Australian manufacturers have tripled under this government. Companies, according to the ACCC, have closed under this government because of the gas crisis. Contract prices have not come down. They're still at 3 times their historical prices, threatening the viability of thousands of manufacturing jobs. And this announcement did nothing to resolve it. Indeed, we've heard this week, with the release of a discussion paper that deals with export controls that we have been advocating for years, to back the interests of Australian manufacturers and Australian households and see less of our gas shipped overseas so that it's reliably and affordably supplied to Australian users. Already they're crab-walking away from that, we read in the Financial Review. That detail, backing the gas companies, the big gas companies again, over the interests of Australian manufacturers, Australian workers and Australian households. And the most extraordinary thing about this gas-fired recovery announcement is you cannot point to a single job that will be created in the timeframe that we require. The next year or two, not a single job that you can point to in that document. So not only does the so-called gas-fired recovery fail to deliver any recovery, it is completely out of touch with the clear message being given by all business groups, by investors, by lenders, by central banks here in Australia and all around the world, and that is that economic recovery pathways out of this COVID pandemic and the recessions that have been driven by the pandemic should be paved with clean energy. The Business Council, the Australian Industry Group, the big banks, the big insurers, the super funds here in Australia have all said the economic recovery pathway must be aligned with a national commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. It's just the smart thing to do. 2 big challenges facing our nation should be dealt with together. And you can deal with them together because paving the pathway out of this recession with clean energy is the smartest way to create jobs. In contrast to the gas-fired recovery that delivers not a single job, the Clean Energy Council makes it clear that renewable energy projects that already have planning approval, ready to go, ready to be built if they had an investment framework that would accommodate them, are ready to create 50,000 jobs, real jobs now. But of course, this government won't commit to net zero emissions by 2050 because the only thing this minister hates more than renewable energy is climate action. Of course, he described climate change in this House as the new climate religion, which has little basis in fact and everything to do with blind faith, again making it very clear where he stands on this seismic challenge to Australia. So even though net zero emissions by 2050 is required by the Paris Agreement that this government signed Australia up to, even though it's required and dictated by all scientific advice about what we need to do for the interests of future generations, even though it's supported and committed to by all state governments, Labor and Liberal alike, federal Labor, every business group, the biggest mining company, the biggest bank, the biggest telecommunications provider, all of the big insurers and investors in this country, even though CSIRO modelling used all the time by the New South Wales Liberal government shows that net zero emissions by 2050 will deliver higher wages, stronger economic growth and lower power bills, that's not good enough for this minister and this Prime Minister. The performance of this government on climate change is abysmal. The Climate Change Performance Index that ranks the biggest 56 producers of greenhouse gases in the world consistently ranks Australia under this Liberal government outside the top 50. Can't even make the top 50 of 56. And that plummeted obviously under Tony Abbott when he was Prime Minister, but it hasn't recovered under either Prime Minister Turnbull or the current Prime Minister, because although the marketing might have changed, the spin might have changed, this government has kept the business model of Tony Abbott, absolutely kept true to it, and there's no better evidence of that than the fact that this minister holds this portfolio. You also see their failure in the emissions data that the government itself publishes. The latest data was published only a few months ago in August, and what it shows is this. In the 6-year period of the last Labor government, emissions came down by 15%. 15% in 6 years. In the 6 years of this government, emissions came down by 1%. 1% in 6 years. It will take 600 years to get to net zero emissions under this government's current rate of emissions cut. The Prime Minister and the Minister again today said we smashed the Kyoto Protocol target. Well, the Kyoto Protocol required us to cut emissions by 5%. And the government's own data shows that we're well short of that. We're well short of that. Now, they try to employ the overachievement during the Labor years driven by policies that they strongly opposed. But what is clear is emissions have flatlined under this government. The second falsehood that this Prime Minister continues to put to the Australian people is that we'll meet and beat our Paris 26% by 2030 targets. Now, it should have been a walk in the park, given the trajectory we were on under the last Labor government. But again, the government's own projections, published last Christmas by the government, not by me, show very clearly we are way, way off track. According to those projections in December 2019, between 2020 and 2030, on this government's policies, for a whole decade we'll cut emissions by 4%. 4%. It will take us 230 years at that rate to get to net zero emissions. By 2030, according to their data, we'll be at 16%, not 26%, just 16%, and that was confirmed again this week by Reputex. So when the Prime Minister says we're meeting and we're beating the Kyoto targets, we're meeting and beating the Paris targets, he is deliberately misleading the Australian people. I'm not just saying that, his own data says it, and the experience of the last 6 or 7 years under this government shows it too. Now, this active opposition, this campaigning against climate action, is obviously important for its own sake, Deputy Speaker. Climate change poses a deep mortal threat to our security and our prosperity today. We'll see that when the Bushfire Royal Commission is finally released. We saw it from the Drought Coordinator's report 12 months ago when he said that climate change is driving more frequent, more intense droughts that affect parts of the country that haven't been traditionally prone to drought. We'll see exactly that advice, I'm sure, from the Bushfire Royal Commission. It's a threat to security and prosperity that we're already seeing play out. It's a threat that will only become deeper for our children, our grandchildren and generations of Australians beyond if we don't act. But it's also deeply irresponsible and negligent because there is a race on around the world, a race for investment and job creation in the transformation of the global economy to a clean energy economy. And that is a race that Australia should be leading. We have the best solar resources on the planet, some of the best wind resources on the planet. And if we harness that with a policy framework of the type you see in so many other democracies around the world, we will be not a renewable energy superpower, we'll be the renewable energy superpower. If there was ever an opportunity for the Liberal Party to break from the Tony Abbott business model on climate change and energy policy, this pandemic was it. Investors want them to do it. Business groups want them to do it. The community and trading partners want them to do it. It's the right path for Australia, a path that should be paved with renewable energy, but they clearly haven't taken it. We just heard a ministerial statement full of the fatuous, ideological claptrap that we've come to expect from him. But indeed, the clearest possible evidence that this Prime Minister has decided to double down on Tony Abbott's agenda is the fact that this minister is still in his job.